My grandmother thought it was her job to do the corrective of what wasn't happening in Sunday school. And so you're right. Jeremiah was not particularly popular on Sunday morning in Sunday school, but Big Mama, she had it covered. One of the reasons she had it covered is because her grandmother was a part of the community that was a part of the Trail of Tears. And so she had heard stories all her life about what it meant to be taken from the place in which you know as home and traversed across an unknown land and put in another place, in which you then needed to create home again. So it was in that context that she was always preparing us for that which we could not foresee. She was always preparing us that there would be changes in our lives that we may not understand or agree with or be in despair about. She was always helping to prepare us. And so what happened down the street at the Baptist church where my cousins went, or what happened across town in the disciples congregation where I was raised, was of no regard to her, really. She had her own curriculum and put us through it as the Spirit led her. So there was always, as I said, there was always singing, there were always songs, there were always hymns and spirituals and gospels and songs that had embedded in the messages about God's ever-active presence in our lives. And so, what we learned from Jeremiah that day, the other thing my grandmother always did was she wanted us to ask questions. You know how when you are in Sunday school, sometimes you're like, you don't want to be the one to ask the question, but she taught us to ask questions. If you don't understand something, if you wonder about something, ask questions. And so we would ask her lots of questions. So we got to learn about who Jeremiah was. But he wasn't particularly popular. He was this small town kind of local boy who understand himself to be called to be a prophet, and he wanted to be like one of those prophets in the temple and be treated well. But he wasn't. He was always on the outside. He was always on the outskirts of the community. So even in the midst of exile and deportation and relocation into Babylon, he was left behind because they thought, what good is he? So we got to learn about Jeremiah, and so those lessons also, at the teaching of my grandmother, spilled over into our everyday lives. So we learned something about how we treat one another. Yeah, we learned about what it means to be bullied and to be able to make the choice not to do that. We learned lots of things from Big Mama in her own way. And so you have Jeremiah, who was thought to be illiterate, speaking to his scribe, Baruch, who writes down this message from God. And I think it's interesting that the message and the word of hope and assurance came from the place in which the people had been pushed out in exile from, because Jeremiah was left behind. And I also think it's interesting that even those people who were in exile, they too had not treated Jeremiah very well. So here comes the message from God from the most unlikely messenger. The most unlikely messenger from the place that they had been told that they had to leave behind. So the people of Judah, Jeremiah says, you are the same people that you were before this change. Yes, the temple where you once worshipped has been destroyed. But remember, what you did when you gathered there as a congregation, you worshiped God. Do you not remember how to worship, even in this new place? Jeremiah says, build, raise up and nurture your families, multiply, do not hold back, increase, increase, increase. Do you not remember how to produce children? Even in this new place where you find yourself. Jeremiah tells them to plant seeds and gardens and to produce the food and what they need for their nourishment. And yeah, what you may have to learn that the same plant that I planted there may not grow here. So you need to learn about the land in which you are now finding that you live. And figure out, what can I grow in this soil? What can I produce that will feed my family in this place? Jeremiah says, connect and be supportive of your neighbors. Do you not remember that you did not always know one another? How did you get to know who your neighbor is? Educate your children. Build up your community. Have the welfare of those who surround you be at heart. For as you raise them up, you too will be raised up. And just know that what is now will not last forever. It will not last forever. There will come a time when once again you will know in your heart of hearts, in your spirit, deep down in your soul, that the God of all life is present with you. That the God of all life does not wish harm for you. Trust in that God. Now, while my grandmother was really big on us reading the scripture, the other thing that was really important for her is prayer. So she would say to us, so what are you going to pray about tonight? What's going to be in your prayer tonight? Will you say a word of thanks to God this evening? You better say a word of thanks to God this evening. In case you wondered whether or not you had the choice of answering yes or no, you better say a word of thanks to God this evening. Will you thank God for your parents? Of course you will thank God for your parents. Will you thank God that you have food and clothes and people around you who love and care for you? Of course you will say thanks to God for all of those things. And then you will ask God, please lead me. Lead me on the path that you would have me travel. So in addition to telling the Bible stories over and over again in her very creative and authoritative ways, she also encouraged us to have a personal spiritual life that included prayer and devotion and connection with God. One of her favorite songs that she would always sing to us, and sometimes she wasn't really singing it to us. It was, again, a part of her own kind of spiritual practice and her own way of remembering the connection with God. It was his eyes on the sparrow. She says, why should I feel discouraged? Why should the shadows come? Why should my heart feel lonely and long for heaven and home when Jesus is my potion, my constant friend is he. For his eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. So if you hear somebody say to you, no, if you're listening to his eye is on the sparrow, that's not real. That's a false message. Do not listen to those. Jeremiah tells us that. Don't listen to those false prophets. Don't listen to those who would steer you away. But listen to those who you know and who you trust, and be willing to give and take. Be willing to have some space between you so that which God is always creating can have opportunity to emerge. The two prayers I read this morning come from an author who I love, John O'Donohue. And it comes from a book called To Bless the Space Between Us. To bless the space between us. He talks about us getting back into, if we're not already there, into the practice of blessing one another and blessing the space that is between us. So it's not just the blessing on the person, but all of that out there between us. You know, being here in Montana, I know the blessing of the space. Just look at the mountains. Just cast your eyes on the snow. Just look at that moose, or not, or that elk, or that beaver, or those deers. Just, you know that there's all this space and stuff that's filled with images of God's blessing is happening in that space between me and you. Between me and you. So O'Donohue says, bless the space between us. This is what I know. That in the beginning, God created the world. And in that process of creation, God created me, and God created you. God created us to be helpmates for one another. As we care for the earth, as we care for one another, as we dare to trust God, a creating God, as we care for that which has been entrusted to us. So let not your hearts be troubled. His tender word I hear, and resting on his goodness, I lose all my doubts and fears. Though by the path he leadeth, but one step I can see, for his eye is on the sparrow, and so I know he watches me. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me.